Bienvenidos al Foro TELOS. Ya sabéis que es un festival de ideas donde nos paramos a pensar cómo nos hemos contado la historia hasta ahora y sobre todo cuáles son los escenarios de futuro que nos esperan. Bienvenidos a este reto, recordar el futuro. Y yo creo que no hay mejor invitado para hablar de todos estos asuntos que Niall Ferguson. No solo es historiador, es el historiador británico más brillante de nuestros tiempos. Es profesor de Harvard y además de la Hoover Institution de la Universidad de Stanford. Autor de 16 ensayos que arrojan luz sobre nuestro pasado para iluminar nuestro futuro, Niall Ferguson tiene realmente un don: explorar asuntos complejos, dar luz al pasado para iluminar lo que nos viene por delante. Y además esto lo hace de una manera sumamente atractiva, de forma que nos tiene totalmente pegados a las páginas de sus libros. Su última obra se titula en castellano Desastre y es una historia de las catástrofes que nos han golpeado para explicar no solo la pandemia, sino los retos que tenemos por delante. While the rest of us spent lockdown reading or learning to bake, Niall Ferguson applied his intellect to the task of placing the pandemic in historical context. In his last book, Doomed, he sets out to understand why humanity, time and again through the ages, has failed to prepare to catastrophe. Professor Ferguson, we have a very ambivalent relationship with catastrophe, the doom. On one hand, we are captivated by catastrophe, but on the other hand, we can't really understand it. And which is more disturbing, it seems that we don't remember the lessons from the past. Do we, as a human race, ever really learn from our mistakes?
I think we try to, but we don't do as well as we should, especially in the 21st century with all the scientific knowledge that we've accumulated. One reason I wanted to write this book was not just to put the pandemic in perspective, but actually to offer a general history of disaster that might help us think about this recurrent but unpredictable feature of human life. I think the reason that we don't learn the right lessons is partly, as you say, because of our ambivalent relationship to disaster. On the one hand, we kind of are fascinated by the idea of the end of the world. This is central to the great religions, Christianity, it's there in Buddhism as well as in Islam. And we also love watching movies or reading books about the end of the world or the extinction of the species. But that's not really the very likely scenario in the foreseeable future. What we can see is that we're much more likely to confront modest, medium-sized disasters, which will perhaps kill a few million of us. But remember, a death toll in the single digits millions is just, in the case of COVID, 0.06% of humanity at most. If you accept a really upper bound, it's like 0.2% of the world's population. Tragic in every case that a life is shortened, but clearly it's not the end of the world. It's clearly not the extinction of the species. So I think we kind of veer between fascination with disaster in the largest sense, fascination with the end of the world, and a kind of failure to prepare for the more likely medium to small size disasters. And the key, I think, is that they're just not predictable. We would love to be able to predict them. We have models that try to predict them. But the truth is that disasters aren't predictable. They come at irregular intervals. They come in unpredictable sizes. And that's, I think, a central problem. We would love Cassandra to tell us what the next disaster will be. We're always looking for a Cassandra to predict disaster, but it doesn't work. And therefore, we just have to accept that the next disaster is inherently unpredictable and will take us by surprise.
As you explained in Doom, you put our current recent disaster to some historical context, and it happens to be that by historical standards, COVID-19 is not really a massive disaster. Could you explain us why?
Well, it's a really surprising thing to say, and most of your viewers will be astonished. But really, it doesn't make it into the top 20 of disasters in human history. If you just compare it with past pandemics, even if you accept the very high estimate of total deaths that The Economist magazine recently published, which is more than 90 million, I mean, that's far higher, nearly 4 times higher than the standard figure that you'll hear quoted on the news, which is more than 5 million. But even if you accept that very, very high estimate, that is still, relative to the world's population, 1/10 the death toll of the 1918-19 so-called Spanish influenza, which wasn't Spanish at all, but just happened to be called Spanish because only the Spanish newspapers reported on it. And that was a really disastrous pandemic that killed closer to 2%, not 0.2, but 2% of the world's population. The Black Death, which was the biggest pandemic in history, probably killed close to 1/3 of all living humans right across the Eurasian landmass. So by comparison with the really big pandemics of the past, I think it's fair to say that this is a medium-sized pandemic, comparable with the 1957-58 so-called Asian influenza, or the 1889-1890 so-called Russian influenza. And nobody really remembers those events. Those are not in most history books. And if you tell people that there were pandemics in 1957 and 1889, they're quite surprised. The key reason that this feels like a huge disaster rather than a medium-sized one is the economic, social, and political consequences, which are much larger than the public health disaster would lead you to expect. That's, as I said in Doom, the really critical point. It's not so much the death toll that distinguishes this disaster. It is the economic, social, and political aftershocks that the disaster has caused.
If COVID-19 wasn't the big one, and we are so unprepared, I'm concerned. I don't know what to expect for the future. Professor Ferguson, are we really all doomed?
Well, we're certainly in trouble if a more contagious, more lethal virus comes along, or if a strain of bubonic plague, which is not viral, develops resistance to antibiotics. It is very easy to imagine a worse pandemic than COVID-19. So that's the first point to notice. The second point is we're not doomed if we learn the right lessons from what has just happened. Because remember, most Western countries, most European countries, most North American countries, including Canada and Mexico, did not do well in this pandemic. But not every country did badly. You can find countries around the world that had virtually no excess mortality last year or this year. I'm thinking of South Korea or Taiwan, or in Europe, Norway. There was a really significant variation between countries that barely had excess mortality and countries that had very elevated excess mortality. So we know that there were ways of dealing with this pandemic that worked, and most Western countries failed to use them. For example, virtually no Western country got testing right quickly enough. And that meant that at the beginning of the pandemic in the United States, where I live, for months, nobody had any idea who was actually infected. And that was an avoidable failure. It was not a mistake the South Koreans made. It was not a mistake the Taiwanese made. In those countries, they also developed systems of contact tracing. The South Koreans did this very well. We took ages to get this right in Europe, and in the United States, it basically wasn't done at all. And finally, I think we did terribly badly in most Western countries when it came to protecting the vulnerable. A very large proportion of the deaths in 2020 were in elderly care homes. And that was another avoidable fail. So I would say that if one looks back on 2020 and indeed into 2021, the death toll from COVID has been much higher than it needed to be. We could have done much, much better. And that tells me that if we learn the right lessons, we should do better in the next pandemic. That's the really important thing. And the reason the reason I wrote the book. I didn't wait for the pandemic to be over because I don't think we can wait. We've got to get on with this and figure out what it is that went so wrong last year. And one thing that's very important is not to draw the wrong conclusions, because if we draw the wrong conclusions about what went wrong, it is going to happen again, and it could be worse the next time.
It is tempting but misleading, you're right, to divide disasters into natural and man-made, because all disasters at all are in some sense man-made. So maybe looking at the future, that's a reason to be hopeful. I mean, maybe the solution is always in our hands, is it?
Well, I think most people do instinctively draw a line between wars, for example, which are clearly man-made, people-made, and pandemics, which, because they're caused by viruses or some other form of pathogen, look like they're natural. But if you think about it for a minute, it's a bit odd to call COVID-19 a natural disaster, because however the virus originated, whether it was in a laboratory or in a so-called wet market, the reality is that the authorities in China, in Wuhan, in Hubei province, in Beijing, screwed up. They tried to cover up what was happening. They allowed the Lunar New Year celebrations to go ahead. And that meant that for weeks, the virus was spreading, not just in provinces of China, but more importantly, all around the world, because of all those direct flights from Wuhan that were going to Europe and to North America. So I think when you ponder it for a moment, you can't really call COVID a natural disaster. And of course, if the virus originated in a lab leak, it clearly was a man-made disaster. We don't know if that's what happened yet, but it's certainly looking more and more likely. The great Indian economist Amartya Sen, an old friend of mine from my Harvard days, once said that we shouldn't call famines natural disasters, that most famines are in fact man-made. And what I've tried to do in Doom is to take that idea and apply it to all disasters, to make the argument that whatever the starting point, whether it's the outbreak of a new virus or a fire or a volcanic eruption, the things that we call natural disasters are only really disastrous in terms of loss of life if we've, for example, built a city at the foot of the volcano, or if we failed to halt the spread of a virus that we might have been able to halt. So the lesson of Doom is that really all disasters are at some level man-made. Sure, the Titanic hits an iceberg, and an iceberg is not man-made, but it's a series of mistakes running from the design of the ship to the way in which it was captained that lead the Titanic to hit the iceberg and sink. And from that point of view, I think we should regard all disasters as to some extent man-made and of course, therefore avoidable, or at least they can be managed better. If a volcano erupts and you've built a city right next to the volcano, then it's going to be much more of a disaster than if the volcano erupts on an uninhabited island.
What did the pandemic teach us about the future that we didn't already know?
Well, at one level, nothing, because we knew for years that a pandemic was a possibility, just as we know right now that an earthquake in California is a possibility. We know that things of that sort can happen because they've happened in the past. What we can't know is when exactly they will happen and how big they will be. So we are, in a sense, back to square one. I can tell you that at some point in the remainder of our lives, we'll probably see another pandemic. After all, COVID is not the first one we've seen in our lifetimes. HIV/AIDS was in many ways a worse pandemic. Though it was a very different virus and a very different disease that it caused, it was worse because we never found a vaccine, and we still haven't got a vaccine, which is why 36 million people have died from HIV/AIDS compared with 5 or 6 million of COVID. But I think there's a slightly more optimistic answer to your question, which is that we can learn that a wide variety of things can strike, of disasters can befall us. And there are wars. just as there are famines, just as there are volcanic eruptions, just as there are pandemics. And we just have to accept that in any given year, there's a chance that we can't exactly calculate that one of these things will happen, and perhaps even more than one of them. We need not to predict them, that's impossible, but just to be ready for them. And I think it's all about improving our readiness and our speed of response. The greatest mistake that was made in nearly every Western democracy in 2020 was to respond too slowly. In the early phase, when we didn't really know much about the disease, except that it was spreading from human to human and seemed to kill elderly people, we were much too slow to take action. And that seems to me the most important lesson. You cannot predict the next disaster, but you can be ready to act very quickly the minute it begins. For example, the first tremor that I feel, the first shaking of the ground that I feel in California should lead me to get out as quickly as possible from a building that might collapse and find a safe place in which to shelter. It's all about speed, isn't it? How quickly do you get out of the dangerous location? If you sit there saying, well, that's a tremor, I wonder if it's going to be a really big earthquake, I'll wait and see, you're more likely, it seems to me, to be injured. So the great lesson, I think, of doom, of catastrophe, my book, is that we need to be quick on the draw, and we need to be ready for every potential disaster rather than focusing on just one disaster scenario that we find really interesting.
Let's talk about information, news, and the internet. We have a plague of disinformation and misinformation, and we know it, but it seems that we just accept it and live with it. You call it infodemic, and I love this word, infodemic. How can we achieve immunity against this infodemic?
Well, there's no vaccine against disinformation or misinformation other than truth. And the question is, how do you get truth into people's heads? It's the same problem as getting vaccines into people's arms. You can produce them, but will people accept them? I think we have often seen in the past that plagues are associated with infodemics, that crazy ideas can spread as fast as any virus. And it's often in a time of crisis that people are most ready to believe crazy things. So that's not new. You could find people in the 1340s in Europe during the Black Death who believed all sorts of extraordinary things. For example, they believed that if they went around whipping themselves, they might be able to ward off a further wave of plague, because they thought that the plague was God's punishment on mankind for being sinful. Now, that's not going to ward off the bubonic plague. If anything, it probably makes people more vulnerable to it. The trouble in our time is slightly different. As usual, crazy ideas circulated. The idea, for example, that you could ward off this particular virus with Lysol, with cleaning fluid, or the notion that it had something to do with the masts for cell phone transmission, or the idea that the vaccine was going to inject a microchip into your bloodstream that would allow some kind of world government to control you. All these crazy ideas surfaced. But the trouble is that today we have something that spreads these ideas extremely effectively, and that's called the internet, or to be more precise, the network platforms like Facebook and Google that dominate the internet. And there's no doubt in my mind that it was the way that these network platforms operated that spread conspiracy theories very rapidly, not only in the United States, but certainly created an anti-vax mentality that was there before, but got a lot stronger over the past 18 months. Now, we don't have a good solution to this problem yet, because we believe in free speech and we don't really want there to be censorship. But I think we could reasonably act in ways that reduce the harm that is done by, for example, Facebook groups that promote anti-vaccination propaganda, not by censoring them, but by making sure that they're not helped. And part of the problem is that, for example, Facebook's algorithm it tends to promote extreme views and fake news because people find those things engaging. And that's a way to sell ads, which is how Facebook makes money. So we've got a problem here that their incentive is to promote the infodemic. And this is extremely harmful to public health. If one could sue a company like Facebook for the harms arising from anti-vax propaganda, we might get somewhere. But under existing legislation, you have absolutely no chance of a legal action against Facebook, even although perhaps 100,000 people have died unnecessarily because they were persuaded not to get vaccinated this year.
You remind us that no amount of technological innovation makes us invulnerable. In fact, it would make us more vulnerable. Why?
I think that the old forms of disaster that haven't gone away, war, disease, have been reinforced by new forms of disaster that our technological advances have made possible. The obvious example of this is that nuclear weapons developed in the 1940s exist on such a scale that if there were a nuclear war, enormous destruction would be caused, far, far greater than in any previous war in history. But that's just one of many examples. It's clear that we do now do far, far more international travel in far larger numbers than was ever possible before. And that's precisely why COVID-19 spread so rapidly around the world. The world had never been as integrated in terms of international air travel as it was by the end of 2019. A third example is that in the pandemic, we became heavily reliant, more reliant than ever on the internet. Conversations like the one we're having now have become absolutely routine, and we all have multiple Zoom or Teams conversations every day. But in a cyber attack that shut down the internet, there would be a new form of disaster. We would suddenly lose the ability to communicate. Imagine if one woke up and the internet was down. We've all experienced that once or twice in our lives just because our local server has malfunctioned. But let's imagine we all wake up and the internet is down and our mobile phones don't work either. That's a new form of disaster that will reveal the vulnerability of our very sophisticated, scientifically and technologically advanced society. So you have to recognize that the old disasters have just been joined by new forms of disaster that people didn't have to worry about in earlier eras in human history. Now, technology, science and technology provide solutions to just about all problems. And a good illustration of this is that we found vaccines against COVID pretty quickly and with very high efficacy in the case of the vaccines produced by Pfizer, Moderna, and AstraZeneca. So let's not be anti-science here. Actually, science did an amazing job last year. And one of the exciting things about writing Doom was the chance to just drink from the fire hose of scientific research as papers were produced every day on different aspects of the crisis. And I think science or scientists did a great job in 2020. So I don't want to be negative, but I think we need to recognize that scientific advances also do create new potentials for disaster. And let's go back to the lab leak hypothesis. If it's true that the virus came from a laboratory that was engaged in research on bat coronaviruses that included gain of function experiments, then that illustrates very clearly how science can in fact lead to new kinds of disaster.
So today, civilization is more fragile as a result of its complexity. But if complexity is irreversible, what should we do to be more resilient in the future?
I think this is a great question to ask. Clearly, the modern world, the global economy, the modern state, these are all complex systems. And we don't understand them very well because actually complexity is quite difficult to understand. But if you look at the research that, for example, my friends at the Santa Fe Institute do on complexity, there are a few obvious takeaways. Some networks, some complex systems are more vulnerable than others. The international financial system in 2008 was an extremely fragile, complex network. The failure of just one node in the network, Lehman Brothers, caused an almost total collapse of the international financial system. And I think the lesson from the financial crisis is that you need to design a financial system that can't be crashed by a single badly managed investment bank. So what we need to be doing when we look at our complex systems is introducing circuit breakers. For example, in the case of a pandemic, it ought to be possible when the news first comes through that there's a new pathogen in city X to cut city X off from international air travel until more is understood about the pathogen. That's what we should have done in the first week of January of 2020. Wuhan should have been cut off then. And it shouldn't have been left to the Chinese authorities to decide this. The World Health Organization should have said there's enough reason to be worried about this for us to shut you down. And if we don't have that power, then we don't have circuit breakers. Now, we all know that in relatively small complex systems, for example, in an apartment block, that if a fire breaks out, there have to be ways of stopping that fire from spreading. And if they don't exist, then you end up with a disaster like the Grenfell Tower disaster in London. It's the same principle applied on a larger scale. When the disaster begins, it is localized by definition. And therefore, you need circuit breakers to prevent it from becoming globalized, to prevent it from spreading. The worst disasters are characterized by contagion, the spread either of a virus or some crazy idea. And what we've really got to do is build into our system something more like circuit breakers or firewalls so that when a disaster happens, we can contain it. And that's the big flaw in most of the systems one sees around one today.
As you explained, the vulnerabilities in the network are rarely where we expect to find it. So how can we find this point of weakness if they are almost invisible?
Well, this is where I think you have to conduct stress tests and exercises. Nobody in the military is surprised by the idea that you have to test out your plan, that you have to have a drill, you have to have exercises, you have to see if things will work in simulations. We don't do much of that in the civilian world these days. I used to, when I was a boy, go to school in Glasgow, and we had pretty regular fire drills. A bell would go off, and we'd all have to get out of the building, and we would stand in the playground, usually in the rain, waiting patiently to be allowed back in. Well, I can't remember the last time a fire drill like that happened at Stanford University, and I've been here for 5 years. So I think part of what's happened is that we've got out of the habit as civilians of doing drills and exercises. There were no pandemic exercises that I can recollect, certainly not in the United States. So I think part of what one needs to do is recognize that you've got to prepare. And preparation is more than a 36-page document saying what you'll do if disaster strikes. There has to be some actual practice, or your disaster response will be unrehearsed and almost certainly unsuccessful. So we need to import from military life some of the ways in which soldiers and sailors and airmen prepare for the next war. We need to be preparing for the next disaster in the same kind of way, doing drills and having a sense of what the plan is. I mean, if an earthquake occurs in California, that's not the moment to go online and Google what to do in an earthquake. You kind of need to know that already before the earthquake begins.
To be prepared, do we have to realize that we can't blame always the person at the top, because maybe that's not helpful?
I think the easiest and also most misleading narrative of 2020 was that it was all the fault of a populist leader. If you were in the United States, it was Donald Trump. If you were in England, it was Boris Johnson. If you were in Brazil, it was Jair Bolsonaro. And I found this story being told over and over again, implying that if someone else had been president or prime minister, there wouldn't have been excess mortality in these countries. And I just think that can't be right. Sure, these guys made multiple mistakes, and I don't, in the book, exonerate them. On the contrary, I look quite closely at some of the crazy things that Trump did that definitely didn't help. But the idea that he was the main reason for what was it, nearly 500,000 deaths in 2020 doesn't make sense to me. It seems that it misunderstands what caused most of those deaths. And I tried to show in the book that the real points of failure were not at the top. They were in the public health bureaucracy. The Centers for Disease Control had as one of its responsibilities making tests available for a new disease. And they completely failed to do that. Not only did they prevent other agencies, including universities, from producing tests, they then produced a test of their own that didn't work. And that wasn't Trump's fault. That was just sheer incompetence at the CDC. And I could go on with a long list of failures like that. So it was a bit of a cop-out to say, oh, if only Joe Biden had been president a year earlier, we would have not had excess mortality. I don't think that can be right. I mean, one illustration of the point is that at the beginning of Barack Obama's presidency, there was a really quite large influenza outbreak in the United States. This was the so-called swine flu, and it infected a really large proportion of Americans. But luckily for the Obama administration, the virus was really not that lethal, and the death toll was quite low. But as Ron Klain said, and he's now Joe Biden's chief of staff, if it had been a really deadly influenza virus, there would have been a public health disaster in Barack Obama's presidency, and there would have been very little he could do about it. So I think we need to stop kidding ourselves that somehow a different president would have had a very different outcome. In fact, we can see that already because Biden's been president since January. It's now November, and it's not as if the pandemic stopped overnight. On the contrary, we're only just coming out of the tail end of the Delta wave, and we're still seeing around 1,000 deaths a day in the United States due to COVID. So this idea that it was all Trump's fault seems like one of the worst conclusions we could draw, because if that's the conclusion we draw, then we naively tell ourselves, well, we fixed it because we got rid of Trump in the 2020 election.
Let's talk about another threats. Even before the pandemic, as you explained, we were already in Cold War II, only China taking the place of the Soviet Union. Has the coronavirus crisis triggered this new Cold War?
I think the Cold War had begun before the pandemic, but the pandemic has revealed it to a lot of people who didn't want to believe it before 2020. I began arguing in 2018 and 2019 that we were in Cold War II with China. And I remember being very surprised when in late 2019, I asked Henry Kissinger what he thought. And this was at a conference in Beijing. And he replied memorably, "We are in the foothills of a Cold War." And last year he upgraded this to, well, we're in the mountain passes of a Cold War. So we kind of clearly, in Kissinger's view, in a Cold War, in the early stages of a Cold War, and it's got worse over the last 2 years. I see no reason to disagree with Henry Kissinger. He knows a thing or two about Cold Wars, and he also knows a thing or two about China. So for me, the debate is over, and those people who want to say, oh no, it's a bad idea to have a Cold War, let's call it something else, or let's pretend that it's not a Cold War, I think they're just deluding themselves. And it's better to recognize that this is a Cold War for two reasons. Firstly, I think if we accept that we're in something very like a Cold War, we will do better. Our research will be better. We'll work harder to get artificial intelligence right. We'll work harder to get quantum computing right, because we'll be in a competition and we will know that the stakes are high. The second reason that I'm in favor of Cold War is it's so much better than hot war, because the alternative to Cold War is not we all live happily ever after. The alternative is that the US and China end up in a real hot war, maybe over Taiwan, maybe over some other issue. And a Cold War is really a way of avoiding that. Luckily, the United States and Soviet Union did not go head to head in a conventional or nuclear war, despite being clearly in a Cold War from the late 40s until the late 1980s. If we can achieve the same with China, that will be a success, because the alternative is something more like what happened between Britain and Germany in the 20th century, where the rising power ended up going to hot war with the incumbent power, not once, but twice, with absolutely disastrous results. So if the choice is between World War III and Cold War II, I vote for Cold War II.
Yes, of course. And are the Western countries in worse or in better shape now to face this second Cold War?
I think in some ways, yes, and in some ways, no. I mean, I think the reality is that the way that the pandemic was handled by the Chinese, including their very clumsy wolf warrior diplomacy after the pandemic had begun, revealed to many Europeans that there is a serious problem, that ultimately China is a one-party state with many of the familiar attributes of a one-party state. And that we need, therefore, not to tell ourselves, oh, it's a normal country or it's moving in the direction of liberalism, because that's just not happening. China's been going in the opposite direction, becoming more authoritarian, increasing the power of the party and of Xi Jinping. So in a good way, I think Europeans had a wake-up call and realized that they could no longer pretend that China was something other than a one-party dictatorship. The problem, I think, is that the economic costs of the pandemic, which have caused a massive growth of the US debt and of the debts of many other Western powers, this crisis of public finance makes it very difficult to commit resources to competing with China. The US defense budget is going to shrink in real and relative terms over the coming years. That means there will be fewer resources available to deter China in the Indo-Pacific region, and in particular to protect Taiwan from the threat of a Chinese invasion. So that's the problem. We kind of see the threat much more clearly than we did before 2020. We understand the nature of the Chinese threat much better, but we're in a poor position to do anything about it other than to use strong words, or, and this is an interesting theme to explore, to try to find common ground with China over climate change, which is the form of disaster that we most like talking about, even though it's a relatively slow-moving form of disaster.
Do you feel that now the world is rethinking its evaluation of American leadership?
I would say it's constantly reassessing American leadership, and it tends to swing from the very negative view, which is often when Republicans are in the White House, to somewhat more optimistic views when Democrats take over. This is especially true in Europe, where for years, all the way back to the time of Ronald Reagan, Europeans tended to prefer Democrats to Republicans. And we've seen one of those great swings from negativity during Trump's administration, because Europeans really did not like Donald Trump, to slight over-optimism about what Joe Biden was going to be able to do. I think this process is one that just goes on, and it's almost a thing that varies from week to week. The big change between the Trump and Biden administrations in terms of foreign policy is that Biden's administration is much more interested in alliances than Trump's was. And that means that there's a new effort in Asia to build relations with Japan, India, Australia, the so-called Quad, or with the United Kingdom and Australia, the AUKUS deal on nuclear-powered submarines. So that's definitely a change. But for the rest of the world, including members of NATO in Europe, it's not quite clear where this all goes, because if we are in Cold War II, it's mainly a trans-Pacific Cold War. What the role of Europe is, that's not clear. And I think there's a good deal of, to use that word again, ambivalence in Europe about exactly the role that Europe would play if the US and China did go head-to-head over Taiwan.
I have another question about China, because we all know that China is collecting data, not only for its citizens. I mean, they have apps in companies like TikTok or Alibaba, which collect massive data all over the world and with no regulations. So could data be the ultimate and most perfect global weapon?
I certainly think we need to be worried about the way in which China's tech companies have spread their influence beyond China's borders. TikTok is just one of many examples one could cite. And it's clear, too, that the way that China regulates its internet companies gives the party, the Communist Party, access to the data of users and not just Chinese citizens. On the other hand, in some ways, the Chinese Communist Party has reined in the big tech companies in the last year. Jack Ma has, in effect, been downgraded, if not cancelled. And more interestingly, the plan that Alibaba had to roll out its great financial offshoot, Ant, to the rest of the world, that plan has been put on hold. I mean, I think if Ant had gone ahead with its IPO, it had a vision for world dominance in electronic payments that really would have been very challenging to the Western world. But it's not happening, or at least it's not happening now. For me, the issue is still an unresolved one. I think most of us understand the problem with a Chinese app like WeChat. We know that anything we say on there is essentially accessible to Beijing, to the Chinese Communist Party. But what's our alternative? The alternative is WhatsApp. Well, anything we say on that is potentially accessible to Mark Zuckerberg. And if it's accessible to him, it's potentially accessible to the National Security Agency. There isn't really privacy available anywhere, not in China and not outside China. And so until we address that problem in the West, until we can come up with a way of using the internet that in fact respects privacy and protects personal data, then I don't think we will have a very strong claim to make. We can't really point the finger at China and say, look at the terrible ways in which your data are used in China, because the Chinese will say, well, look at the terrible ways your data are used in the United States. That's a problem we have to fix in the West before we can really criticize China credibly.
Professor Ferguson, are some societies better prepared to handle certain disasters and to face the future?
I think there's some really striking variation, but it's not as simple as some people think. It's not like dictatorships do better than democracies. There really is, I think, a lot of confusion about this. Sure, the Chinese were able to stop the virus spreading to the rest of their country after they'd allowed it to spread to the rest of the world. But I don't think we should look at what happened in China as something to copy, because the Chinese lockdowns were draconian, much stricter than anywhere else, and they continue to this day. China lives in this extraordinarily locked down state, which makes travel there extremely difficult. And I think it will remain that way, at least until the end of next year. Many authoritarian states did very badly. Russia is still doing very badly with COVID. Iran did terribly at the beginning. And some democracies really were the role models. I'll mention them again: South Korea and Taiwan. They were the winners last year. And of course, it was democracies that produced the most effective vaccines, whereas the Chinese vaccines turned out to have pretty low efficacy. So it's not a clear-cut story here. I think the countries that are best positioned for the future are the ones that have understood how technology can help make a society respond more rapidly and efficiently to any form of disaster. Everybody in Europe should be sending a delegation to Taipei to work with Audrey Tang, the Taiwanese digital minister, on how you did it. We can learn so much from what they did right last year, and that's not happening. In fact, we continue to ignore Taiwan, and some countries almost pretend it's not there because they don't want to upset Beijing. But I think it's all about taking advantage of what technology can do, to quote Audrey Tang, to make government more accountable to the citizens and not the other way around. There are a few countries in the Western world doing this. Estonia, for example, has pioneered what I might call smart government, but the rest of the Western democracies are kind of still working with the bureaucratic system that evolved in the middle of the 20th century. And by and large, we use technology very ineffectively, whether it's in healthcare or in any other public service.
Speaking about the future, can we talk about future in singular, or it would be better to talk about multiple futures? Because I mean, to talk about multiple futures is hard because uncertainty.
I've always said that the idea of the future is as a misleading one, a bit like the idea of the science. These things are not monolithic, and at any given moment we face multiple futures, perhaps an infinite number. We can imagine different scenarios. We can probably carry in our heads several different futures. The challenge is knowing which is going to happen. And as you said, a lot of what determines outcomes lies in the realm of uncertainty. I know roughly my probability of having an automobile accident on my way home. I can calculate that because it's kind of normally distributed. I can't really tell you what the likelihood is that an earthquake will strike before I get home. So this all lies in the realm of uncertainty. Same with wildfires, same with all the kind of big disasters. I mean, I know there's some risk of a war between the US and China in the next few years, but I can't tell you more than that. I can't say exactly what the probability is. So that means that we live under much more uncertainty than we're comfortable with. And that also means that we have to keep in our heads more scenarios than we're comfortable with. We like one thing to worry about. Human beings love to worry about one thing, and that's why we have a whole industry of people who worry about climate change and nothing else. Now, I don't deny that climate change poses a serious threat to the stability of the planet. The threat varies enormously from place to place. We don't really know how it will manifest itself because the planet itself is a complex system, but I certainly take it seriously. But it's not the only thing that we should be worrying about. As 2020 showed us, a pandemic moves much faster than climate change. And as we were all standing around in January at the World Economic Forum in Davos talking about climate change, the pandemic had already begun. And I couldn't get people to see that we should change the subject and focus on the disaster that was unfolding rather than the disaster that is maybe decades away.
And what's about the past? Is the past as monolithic, as consistent as we tend to think?
It's not, because it recedes very quickly. Our memories are terribly unreliable. And then historians get to work arguing about what happened. And ultimately, to understand the past, you quickly have to realize that there are multiple competing versions of the past. And that can only really be resolved through quite rigorous study. Even the history of last year has already, I think, begun to be written in ways that are quite misleading. So the only thing that's really singular is the present. There's one present, we're in it now, and there really can't be another. But I'm afraid as we move forward in time, the things that happen in the past quickly get resorted in our heads. Trust me, your memory is a very unreliable historian. It doesn't want to remember the bad stuff. It tends to exaggerate the amount of good stuff that you did. And therefore, you actually need to be your own historian and try to keep yourself honest about the mistakes that you made. That requires a constant effort, looking back, admitting the things that you got wrong. Very few academics do this because they love to feel right. They'll always tell you about the things that they got right, never about the things that they got wrong. I try to be a bit different about that by acknowledging the things that I've got wrong in the past and trying to be rigorous about the ways in which I miscalculated. But that's really not how we're wired. We're wired to tell ourselves good stories about the past. And part of the job of the historian is to spoil those good stories with a little bit of truth.
Professor Ferguson, I have two last questions. At the end of your book, Doomed, you have reference to dystopian novels, because maybe we might have some better understanding of the future reading this kind of works. Do you think that there is more freedom of speech in this kind of works, in dystopian novels, in science fiction, than in other kinds of works or literature?
I do think that there's a great freedom to the authors of science fiction that is rarely granted to the writers of history, and that's reasonable. Science fiction writers are imagining plausible futures, sometimes implausible futures. I had the privilege just the other night in Seattle to have a drink with one of my heroes, Neil Stevenson, the author of such brilliant books as Snow Crash. And we talked about the very different ways in which we think about the world. My job is to work out what happened in the past, get it right, no flights of fancy, minimal imagining beyond trying to imagine what was really going on. Neil Stevenson's job is to imagine futures, including in his most recent novel, a future in which geoengineering happens to kind of halt climate change, or at least to interfere with it. I think one reason I went back to reading science fiction was to keep my imagination supplied with future scenarios that I, as an historian, might not think up. So yeah, I think there's a great role to be played for anybody who's trying to understand the world by reading science fiction, as well as, of course, reading history.
Professor Ferguson, the last question is about my future. My future as a reader. What are you writing now?
I'm writing the second volume of The Life of Henry Kissinger, which I published the first volume of back in 2015, and I am determined to get that book published in 2023 to mark Henry Kissinger's 100th birthday. So that will be my next publication. Beyond that, I have no plans to write any more books.
I'm willing to read the second volume of Henry Kissinger Memories. Thank you so much, Professor Ferguson, for being with us here today at Foro TELOS. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Marta.
Pues muchísimas gracias a todos vosotros por habernos acompañado en este Foro TELOS, recordando el futuro, hoy con Niall Ferguson. Ya sabéis que os esperamos aquí en este Festival de las Ideas para hablar de cómo hemos contado el pasado y de lo que viene en el día de mañana.